the steps to end and redress this genocide.
I am up against the truck.
The frustration, it's unbelievable. You see in their eyes, like they're just wearing it.
Today on Context, hearing Canada's First Nations voices, a complicated dispute has resurfaced between Canada's First Nations and Canadian commercial fishermen. It comes down to a peace treaty signed by the Crown in the 1760s, when the Supreme Court ruled that Indigenous communities have the right to fish for a moderate livelihood. But there was also a clarification that affirmed Ottawa's right to regulate and ensure conservation.
We recognize the rights of Indigenous communities to moderate livelihood fishing.
Indigenous fishermen say non-Indigenous fishers have threatened and intimidated them for their off-season fishery, vandalizing Indigenous vessels, traps, and equipment. Today on the program, former New Brunswick politician Susan Levi-Peters, along with the president of the Maritime Fishermen's Union, Lex Brukovskiy, present their concerns. And Professor Karen Lawford joins us to speak about the most vulnerable of the Indigenous population, women and girls. And on the queue, Kallie Wood and McKee discuss the road to reconciliation. But first, here's Maggie John.
Fishing is part of First Nations culture and identity. It's also a constitutionally protected right. Treaties, crisis, and reconciliation is what our next guest, former Elsipogtog First Nation Chief Susan Levi-Peters, is educating us on. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Maggie.
So what is really happening on the ground now, especially when it comes to this fisheries crisis?
Well, there's a lot of conflict happening because there's a lot of misunderstanding between the definition of moderate livelihood and who has the right to it. So there's been a lot of stuff happening. There was boats burning. There was stuff happening, but it has kind of died down a little bit now. There's been more negotiations going on.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. What are the efforts in trying to solve this dispute that you know of?
Well, actually, couple of the First Nations in Nova Scotia got together and they bought the fishery company, the Clearwater company, 50% of it. So I think what's happening now is that my people are getting together and they're getting involved more in a moderate livelihood of getting involved. It's just of just going out fishing and getting into disputes and all that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. That's new news that Mi'kmaq First Nations people have just purchased 50% of Clearwater fisheries. How can you see that maybe changing this dispute in the near future?
Oh, it's going to change it a lot because now we're part of the society, part of the economics. Like before, we were more of a liability. Nobody wanted to work with us, and when we talked about moderate livelihood, we would be arrested or we would be confronted. Now with this, is showing there's a lot of partnership and people are trying to learn about each other and working together so that we won't have another of what happened in Digby or even what happened here in New Brunswick 7 years ago. So we're moving forward, and it's very positive and very overwhelming because it's very hard when you're in the front lines, and it's very hard when you face poverty or you're homeless or jobless, and you see it in the media saying that First Nation people are getting millions and all this, and you're back home facing poverty or homelessness. Right. It doesn't make sense. And then when you go out to try to earn a moderate livelihood, then you're criminalized. So there needs to be a lot of education, and that's happening right now with a lot of social media, a lot of sharing of stories like you are today. So like we are today, like sharing it with Canada. So yes, it's we're moving in a very, very positive direction from where we've come from. Yeah.
As a Christian, what should be the faith response to this dispute, to this action that we're seeing right now in Nova Scotia?
see that there, what it is like to understand us as Mi'kmaq people, like we have these peace and friendship treaties that were signed in the 1700s, and all it is that we have peace and friendship with each other, and that's why Canada is a diverse country. You have multi different cultures here in Canada, and that's part of the treaty, that everybody is welcome as long as you protect Mother Earth for seven generations to come, and you respect each other's laws, and that goes with us. So we have, but unfortunately for the last 100 years since the residential school and everything, we've been put in little reserves, and we faced the cycle of abuse and all that. So now we're coming out, and historically we were known as the peacekeepers. We had treaties with the Pope going back, with France, with Great Britain, and they're all peace and friendship treaties. Right. And all these things that we can all live in peace and harmony amongst each other. So it's for me, being a historian, like studying my histories and being brought up with it, seeing something like this, having a positive agreement or a resolution coming that way is good. It's very positive for us, because we face a lot of negativity. Yeah. Even with the murdered and missing Indigenous women, like it's hard for us to go even outside our reserve because of the culture shock and everything.
You're seeing that this is hopeful. This is a hopeful transition and a hopeful change.
Definitely, yes, very hopeful, and it's a very something to look forward to, and something that's our kids will have jobs, or will have a future, a positive future. So yes, it's very, very hopeful.
All right, Susan Levi-Peters, thank you so much for joining us and informing us about what's happening in this dispute and crisis among many Indigenous peoples. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Maggie.
Terry LeBlanc is here to let's talk about this recent big news of Mi'kmaq First Nations 50% stake in Clearwater Seafood Incorporated for $1 billion. Again, big news. How does this affect the fisheries dispute in Nova Scotia?
Well, Maggie, that remains to be seen, since it is such a recent announcement and the details of it have yet to be released in terms of how the Mi'kmaq Fishers and the Mi'kmaq Fishery Consortium, consisting of 7 communities in Nova Scotia, are going to deal with this. As you may recall, Clearwater was referenced by both the Mi'kmaq Fishers and the non-Mi'kmaq Fishers during this dispute as a large corporate fishing giant that has essentially an unrestricted season and unrestricted range in the off-coast or offshore fishery. So it remains to be seen. We'll know in the days ahead, I suppose, as the details of the announcement are released in terms of how the Mi'kmaq and the other members of the consortium will be dealing with the work of Clearwater Fisheries.
Tensions in Nova Scotia between the commercial lobster fishers and Indigenous fishers are ongoing. Both communities are under duress. Lex Brukovskiy is the new president of the Maritime's Fishermen's Union. Lex, thanks for joining us today. Tell us what's going on from your side of the dispute.
We're trying to find a resolution here to this conflict.
There has been a lot of talk over the past couple weeks that this is a race issue. What would you say about that?
This is the farthest thing from the truth. This community here is the friendliest community that I've ever come across. I've traveled the world and lived many different parts of this planet and this country. And to me, when I moved here about 11 years ago, this community welcomed me with the open arms and gave me all the tools and opportunities that anybody would need to be where I am now. So to hear that anybody is racist here is the furthest thing from the truth. Okay.
What are your thoughts on the reports of violence and fires that kind of started this off in September?
Well, of course, we condemn any kind of acts of violence. In fact, it's people are frustrated. Yeah, it's hard to control any particular individual that would have gone over the edge, but we definitely don't agree with any act of violence. We always wanted to resolve this at the table, and we're still looking for that seat at that table. Unfortunately, right up until now, we still have no seat, and we still have no one to talk to.
Okay, let's delve into that a little bit more. You say that there's no seat, you want to have a seat at the table, but there is no seat at the table. Explain why. What is stopping this conversation from moving forward then?
Well, it seems like nobody wants to have the representative from the commercial fishermen side at the table to hear our concerns and our opinions and our input. From what I've been hearing lately over the weeks, it's basically, as Chief Mike Sack and Fishery Minister Bernadette Jordan stated, that it's a nation-to-nation discussion, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and worries for the commercial fishermen, because their livelihood is being discussed without their input.
Okay, and recently your predecessor, Joel Comeau, resigned, stepped down from this position that you've just inherited. You're obviously hoping to bring change. What change are you hoping to bring forward to your group?
Well, like I said, we're at least trying to have a dialogue with somebody, either whether it be Bernadette Jordan or the First Nation community. We just need to sit down at the table and all agree on something, because as of right now, everybody has their own opinion and their own strategy, and nobody's agreeing on anything. So unless we can sit down and have a dialogue, this conflict will continue.
I'm curious, what would it look like for you to feel like you're being justified, that the fishermen, the commercial fishermen, are being heard? What do you want to see happen?
Well, we want to make sure we are taking care of our lobsters. Conservation is a big issue here. We want to make sure we have lobsters for years to come for both the commercial fishermen and the First Nation. We believe the way this moderate livelihood is practiced right now is not a good conservation method. We believe it's destroying the stock, and we should all sit down and figure out a way how we can both practice our commercial fishery and moderate livelihood in a way where it's not going to deplete the stock.
Okay.
By, for example, like having a certain season where we can fish a certain species during that season, and let the off season for to let the stock replenish.
Okay, it is a complex dispute, complex issue. Thank you again, Lex Brukovskiy, president of the Maritime's Fishermen's Union. Thank you for your time today. Coming up, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the horrific case of Joyce Sheshakwan. What do these cases say about how Indigenous women are treated in Canada? Queen's University professor Karen Lawford joins us for the conversation.
The steps to end and redress this genocide must be no less monumental than the combination of systems and actions that have worked to maintain colonial violence for generations.
The rise in news headlines across Canada about issues affecting Indigenous peoples have been tragic, not the least of which was last year's shocking missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report. The report found persistent and deliberate human and Indigenous human rights violations and abuses are at the root cause behind Canada's staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and people, and calls for transformative legal and social changes to resolve the crisis. Professor Karen Lawford teaches gender studies at Queen's University and is an expert in Indigenous health and wellness. Professor Lawford, thanks for joining us again on Context today.
Thank you for having me.
So first question, the final report last year revealed multi-generational and intergenerational trauma and marginalization in the form of poverty, insecure housing, and homelessness, along with barriers to education, employment, healthcare, and cultural support. Has anything changed since this report?
My understanding is that there's not been systemic solutions directed to the numerous issues raised in the report. The issues that we are seeing in this country are actually from systemic abuse, systemic racism, and goals to civilize and assimilate Indigenous peoples. I haven't seen a change, and I doubt anyone else has either.
It's frustrating, to say the least, wouldn't you say, for those that invested in this report and yet to not see any change?
It is frustrating. I think we might see pockets or small places of improvements to help people, but we're not seeing systemic change in this country. We're not seeing systemic change in the province of Ontario where I live, and we're not seeing systemic change even at the municipal level.
During the inquiry, experts and knowledge keepers spoke to specific colonial and patriarchal policies that displaced women from their traditional roles in communities and governance, that diminished their status in society, leaving them vulnerable to violence. Is there a change there? Are you seeing a change in community?
I think one of the challenges to this issue is that when white settlers came to this country to colonize the land, or what is now known as Canada, it was a complete displacement of Indigenous governance systems. And with that, the loss of Indigenous women and Two-Spirits leadership within those governance systems. So these Indian Act reserves that we're seeing and engaging with at the federal level, do they represent our pre-colonial ideas in context of leadership and governance? And I don't think they do.
So what I'm hearing is more conversation needs to happen at the table.
Definitely more conversation and a change, a shift into the inclusion of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit leaders in our governance systems at all levels of governance, not just the ones that get to be at the big tables with federal leaders.
Right. Okay, let's switch to a story that shocked all of us. Joyce Echaquan, the mother of 7 who died in hospital in Quebec, was verbally abused as she videotaped herself as she passed away in hospital. Do you think there is a two-tier system in Canada, one for BIPOC community and one for everyone else?
I think there's many levels of healthcare systems in this country. There's a federal healthcare system that is provided to those who live on reserve and Inuit. There's also the federal healthcare system for federal inmates, recent immigrants, military, and RCMP. That's just one of them. Then you look at all the healthcare systems on reserves that are not under the same type of rules as the Canada Health Act. We have more than 2 tiers of healthcare systems, and definitely those living and in provinces and those that are white have better healthcare, and all the data shows that.
Okay, there's so much to talk to you about, Professor Lawford, but our time is up. Thank you again for joining us today. Again, Professor Karen Lawford, thank you.
Thank you.
Still ahead, we examine the Christian response on both sides of Canada's complicated Indigenous issues, searching for meaning, healing, and reconciliation.
It's very unfortunate what we're going through. I feel their pain. I'm with them. You know, it latches right onto me. I have to ground myself. You know, I pray every day for a good result and a peacefulness. Like there's nothing I want more.
And now it's time for the Q, an opportunity to discuss different views and opinions on this week's topic. What does a path to reconciliation with First Nations peoples look like? Chris McKee and Kallie Wood know that it looks like firsthand. They both work to promote reconciliation and conflict management, bringing truth and understanding into this unique space. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
So Chris,
Thanks, Maggie.
Let's start with you, Chris. There are generations of pain and genocide that has been inflicted on Indigenous peoples. Is reconciliation possible?
It's absolutely possible, yeah. I mean, we're taking strides every day to move
towards that spectrum. And I think it's all about that education component and understanding where we've come from.
What does education look like for you, Chris?
But
Especially coming
I
from a
think
non-Indigenous perspective.
I think education really starts at a young age. And I mean, education for those kids that are in school, those children that are learning. I know when I was in all through my education, we never heard anything about Canadian history. And we learned a lot overseas about the genocide that happened there. But the fundamentals in our own backyard weren't taught. We're getting there, and it's starting to be put into schools. But I mean, we've got a long way to go. And we've also got the gap that my generation who's raising children didn't learn these things. So education also needs to be provided and given the opportunity for that generation as well to know how we move forward.
Yeah. Kallie, we heard today on our show about the fisheries dispute in Nova Scotia. We're going to hear about the Caledonia dispute later on our show in another episode. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, and the need for changes in everything from healthcare to safety, among others. What, in your estimation, as someone who teaches on this, what's the first step to reconciliation?
Well, I think looking at reconciliation, you cannot have reconciliation without facing truth. And part of that truth is, a very sad history in our country. And so in order to move reconciliation forward, it goes back to, the question you asked Chris about education. And how are we walking our next generations through this? And how are we educating today on, like you said, we're talking about the fisheries and Mi'kmaq fisheries. When we look back at the treaties and understand that history in this country, and those signatures that were applied to the treaties and the inherent rights of land, these are conversations that, because it hasn't been taught in our history, we have a lot of work to do. And as Chris said, it is happening, but I'm always encouraged when we go and do the work that we do, because it is changing. A light has been coming on. And, now that our youth are coming home from school and saying, I learned this in school, parents are actually taking the initiative to listen into to sessions like this, to go on and do some of their own research, to walk through different exercises that they can go through in learning, reading, going to resources, that sort of thing. So there's lots of ways that we can move it forward, but the truth is what's going to heal and move us forward.
Chris, I want to hear how you and Kallie work together to bring conversation of healing and reconciliation into different workspaces. Tell us how what that looks like today.
Well, I mean, I think today's world, it's a very rare situation when you have a 6'2" non-Indigenous man on stage with an Indigenous mother and matriarch and delivering a message that the wrongs of the past are in fact true and we need to recognize them. And you get to see that from both sides of the fence, so to speak. I mean, we both got a different lens, we both have a different background, and just in order to educate, we can't just have one perspective when we move forward. We need to have multiple perspectives, and I think that's the power of being one humanity and moving in that changing direction together.
So how much of this pain that we hear of, again, all of these disputes that we're hearing about is lack of keeping promises, keeping treaties, and going back on the word of our land, Kallie?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it. Looking at the disputes right now, with our Mi'kmaq lobster fishermen, it goes back to the inherent rights of, and looking at the Constitution Act and the treaties that were there in Section 35 of the Constitution Act. It's very well stated there that, we can provide a livelihood from fishing, hunting, trapping, and that sort of thing. So it very much goes back to the treaties and understanding, long before Canada existed. Before North America, we were Turtle Island, and when we signed into these treaties and gave up land, we talk about Crown land, we talk about, these were signed agreements that this is how it would continue forward. So I think when we're looking at how do we move forward in reconciliation, how do we share the land, and how do we do this in a good way, the creator, when we look at Mother Earth and we look at the two different ideologies of what it looks like to be land and water keepers, and what it looks like to be doing this together. And I mean, obviously we have to just not understanding, and as it goes back to the education piece, you don't know what you don't know, but then we also have to come to that appreciation of one another's cultures,
right?
And understand. So
yeah. I want to hear from both of you on our last question. What does faith look like? What does a faith response look like in all of this when we are walking into reconciliation? Chris, what about you? What does faith look like?
Well, I think faith looks different from different people's lenses and their place of worship. But as a country and as a world, the one thing that we have in common across the board in every small town, in every community, in every city, everywhere that we go, there's a place of worship. And that's where we need to start. And that worship needs to really move that dial forward. And the fact of the matter is, church starts on Monday. It's not about 2 hours or 3 hours one day a week. Church starts on Monday, and how are we going to lead, and how are we going to change going forward in the right, faithful way?
Yeah, well said. Our time is up. Oh, so much to talk about. Thank you again, Kallie Wood and Chris McKee, for joining us today. We've covered a lot of ground today on our special Indigenous Peoples program. In the coming weeks, we go to Caledonia to continue the conversation when I sit down with the leader of the Six Nations land protesters and the mayor of Caledonia. We will listen to both sides of this complex land dispute. Our world today is fraught with injustice and issues that need to be rectified. Of course, we're not going to achieve that in a television program, but we hope that you got a good sense of the long-standing issues plaguing both sides of these historical disputes and the need for healing. Our producers and I on the show, Susan, Fatin, Christine, and Alex, work diligently to find both sides of the issues we cover. But it's not always possible, but we would love to hear from you. So please visit our website, Twitter, or Facebook, and let us know your thoughts. We could not do this show without our donors, for whom we are extremely grateful. Christian analysis on news is needed now more than ever. If you'd like to find out more on how you can support, go to our website, context.show. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. Thanks for watching.